Good morning, Year 9. Welcome to Lesson 4 of History. Last week we looked at the impact of World War I, so we looked at what World War I did, how the problems that it caused. Today we are going to look at post-war Germany. So we're going to look at what happened to Germany after the war. So we've seen how during the war it affected people, a lot of people affected through death and through poor health. And now we're going to look at the impact on the government after. So we're going to understand the political problems Germany faced and also evaluate the threat posed by communists in Weimar Germany. So the first thing I'd like to do is give me 5. Draw around your hand in your book or on your piece of paper, and in each finger write down an impact that the First World War had on Germany, and in the palm you can do a summary about whether the war had overall a positive or a negative impact on Germany, and you can pause the video and have a go at doing that now. So you might have got things like increased government debt, war weariness, people in the turnip winter, low wages, lots of strikes happening, food shortages, political changes, the government with the king deciding to leave and escape from Germany. So any of those things would have been fab. So after the First World War and the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, just before then, if you remember, on the 9th of November, between the 9th and the 10th, the Kaiser left Germany. He fled. And so the SPD government, the Social Democratic Party, set up a new democratic government, which was known as Weimar. And Germany at this point after the war was really quite divided. There was a lot of people, particularly sort of Prussian military leaders, who were shocked that the Kaiser had gone. They were used to a country that was run by this monarchy, and they weren't particularly happy that it had become a republic. And became more democratic, and also they weren't particularly happy that the SPD were the ones that were leading it. And when this new government was set up, Berlin was really quite unsafe because there were so many people unhappy, and they were arguing, there was lots of rebellions, fight for power, that the government had to actually go and set up somewhere else. So we get this, it's called the Weimar Constitution and the Weimar government, because they fled to Weimar in order to create this and have their discussions. And the Weimar Constitution was the new sort of order of things in Germany, and this is what it looked like essentially. So at the top of the main person in charge of Germany now is known as the president, and the president is elected every 7 years. So you have them for 7 years unless anything happens. They are in charge. They are also in charge of the army, so they're the supreme commander. They can't be questioned on that. And also they've got this special thing called Article 48. And this meant that if there was an emergency, if there was like a declared state of emergency, then the president could make all the laws and keep a chancellor in office without the support of the Reichstag. So he wouldn't have to. The Reichstag is another word for our governments. It's like our parliament, the Reichstag. So the Reichstag is essentially parliament. Still after 4 weeks cannot write on these PowerPoints, so I apologise, okay? But the Reichstag is essentially the parliament. And usually, in order to get things passed and to make laws, they would need to go through the Reichstag. But if there was an emergency and he decided to implement this Article 48, then he could make whichever laws he wanted. Now, at the moment, this is okay, it's not really a big issue, but when we come to look at Germany next year and we get to Germany in the 1930s and we start to meet a guy called Mr. Adolf Hitler, then we can see Article 48 becoming a little bit of an issue. So bear that in mind next year. We've got the president. He has a chancellor, so the chancellor was chosen by the president, but the chancellor does need to have some support in the Reichstag, so he needs to have the support of the government in order to have that position. And within the Reichstag, you've got, in 1919, 421 members, and they were elected every 4 years. And they were actually really quite important because they helped make the laws. They also helped support the Chancellor. And then you've also got this Reichsrat, which is the representatives from the states. So if you remember from before the First World War in the German constitution, we've got the Bundesrat. It's basically the same as that, okay? And that's the representatives from the 18 German states. They could not make laws, but they could approve them and approve ones proposed by the Chancellor and the Reichstag. And the other important thing to know, and which is very different to what it's like in Britain at this moment in time, as in 1919, men and women over the age of 20 could vote. So they're voters, they're appealing to every adult. Okay, so over the age of 20, no other restrictions. If you're over 20, you were male or female, you were able to vote. So really important. So this was the whole Weimar Constitution. And it was good, but it was also quite weak in other respects as well. So you've got the Germans having equal rights, which is great. They had something called proportional representation. Now, don't worry too much about this because I will go through this a lot more next year. It's once you get it, it's not as difficult as you think. But proportional representation made sure that all political parties were allocated seats in Parliament in proportion to the number of votes that they got, so that it was fair. So basically, the number of votes you got was the number of seats you got, therefore fair. Great. They had a strong president who could then keep control over the country and protect the country in crisis if it wanted to use Article 48. And each state could keep their own traditions, which was nice because it meant that it wasn't causing as much conflict as in Germany before, when the Kaiser was trying to unite everyone to be exactly the same. However, there were some weaknesses in the constitution. So, for example, in 1919, the Republic had a lot of enemies. People weren't happy about the end of the war. If you remember last year, not everyone realised that they were going to lose the war. They were being fed propaganda. They thought that they'd won the war, and it became quite a bit of a shock. And the first people that they blamed was the government, particularly as the Kaiser had fled. They decided to blame the government and said that they'd sort of stabbed them in the back by signing an agreement to end the war and say that they'd lost the war. Okay, and when the Treaty of Versailles was announced and released, it only made matters worse. And although proportional representation was fair because you got equal number of votes, equal number of seats in Parliament, the other problem was it encouraged a lot of small parties to get a small number of MPs, and therefore there was always a coalition government. And a coalition government is when you don't have one sole party. So, for example, in our government, it's like saying you don't just have the Labour Party in the lead. It's splitting sort of its government with Conservative, for example. That's a coalition government. If Labour and Conservative got the same amount of votes, they would become a coalition government. Okay, and the problem with that is that because you've got two different parties that are having to work together, they don't always have the same mindset. They don't have the same vision for the country as each other, and therefore that's going to cause an awful lot of tension and friction. And if that one party wanted to really change welfare and introduce lots of new welfare reforms and the other party didn't, they're going to have a problem trying to pass those laws. So when you have a coalition government, it's not as productive and you never get as much passed. Okay, so that was the big problem with proportional representation. It meant that an awful lot of the governments that we see in Weimar Germany are coalition governments, and therefore there's not an awful lot getting done. But again, we'll come into this more detail next week. I'm just giving you a brief overview. And then the president had a lot of power, and it is possible that he could turn himself into a dictator. Does that happen? And the states could also be quite hostile even to the government, and they could try and overthrow it. So that was another weakness. So just in your books, you can copy this table if you want, or just summarise it in your own words. But can you just pause and have a go at summarising the strengths and the weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution? You can go back a little bit if you want and just maybe make a rough guide of the diagram of the Weimar Constitution to help you as well. So a lot of people say, was the Weimar government doomed from the start? So when it became a government, when it formed, There was a lot of violence, there was a lot of people not happy with the government, particularly when it was being formed, and therefore some people say that the Weimar government, the Weimar Republic, was never going to last very well, was never going to do very well, because no one supported it from the very beginning. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to watch the clip. So on the comments section at the bottom of this, you will see it, and it's just about an 8-minute clip, I think it is, about Germany. And I want you to watch the clip and make some notes on the impact of the First World War, but particularly how the First World War has affected Germany and its economy and politics. And it also talks about the Treaty of Versailles. You may remember it because you may have watched this at the beginning, well, just before Christmas, when we looked at the Treaty of Versailles in history. So you might be able to go back and have a look, and particularly think about the terms of the treaty. Why were people not happy? What happened? So pause and have a go at that. So hopefully you enjoyed that clip. Brilliant if you did. I'm not going to go into the Treaty of Versailles. We've done quite a lot of the Treaty of Versailles this year. We've looked at a lot of sources. We've looked at how it made the German people really quite angry because they had to accept the full force of the blame. They weren't allowed a navy. They had to have a limited army to 100,000. They had to pay all of the reparation payments. They had to give up some of their land. So it caused an awful lot of friction, an awful lot of tension. And again, the Treaty of Versailles just kind of emphasised the hatred for this new government, because they blamed the government because the Treaty of Versailles, they had to sign it as well to say they'd accept it. But the problem was, if the government didn't sign it and accept it, then there would be no truce and there could be another war again, which Germany was just not capable of going to war again. It was really poor, broke. There was hardly any soldiers left. They couldn't afford to go to war. They wouldn't have been successful. They would have just lost. So they had to sign this Treaty of Versailles. But this obviously caused tension, which you probably got from the clip. So we're going to focus on some of the political tensions today and next week for our final lesson. And just to make it a bit clear, it might help actually if you kind of pause here, put a little pause, and just maybe make a note of this in your books, because it will help you. We will talk about sort of left wing and right wing, and this is just to kind of give you a bit of an idea. So if I'm talking about people on the left, okay, I'm talking about political parties like the communists. Okay, now communists were also known as socialists. Now we obviously know the SPD are in power. They are the Social Democratic Party. Now they are not as far over onto the left as the communists. They are a bit more towards the centre. Okay, so they've got similar ideas to the communists, but they're not exactly the same as the communists. Communists wanted the workers to control Germany, to share the wealth. They wanted they were very popular with the workers. The working class would often vote for them and side with them. They were very much against a democratic government. They were feared particularly by the middle classes and the wealthy, because they wanted to sort of share things in the government, and that wasn't really particularly. It wanted a lot of equality, and that there should be no private property. And obviously the wealthy wanted to keep their property, wanted to keep their money, and that didn't appeal to them. Then we've got the Social Democratic Party, okay, the Social Democrats, who were in power. So these were the new government after the Kaiser. They were anti-communist. So even though they were kind of a little bit more onto the left, they didn't support the communists. They wanted to help prevent revolution. They didn't want a big revolution in Germany. And they also wanted to help German businesses to recover, okay. So they wanted to introduce some reforms, and they wanted to help workers and to create more of an equal distribution of money, but not as much as the communists did. Okay. And then we've got political parties on the right. And when we talk about political parties on the right, some examples of these are, for example, the Nazi Party. So the Nazi Party isn't what's known as an extreme right party, and we'll come into that in a little bit more detail later. But for example, we have nationalists. So nationalists wanted to make a strong Germany and a strong leader. So they wanted a big, strong leader, a big, strong Germany, a bit like Kaiser Wilhelm. So they were obviously upset that Kaiser Wilhelm had gone, because that was the kind of thing that they liked. A strong leader, having strong ideals, wanting to create a strong Germany, just like Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted. That was kind of their ideal. They were against this democratic government. They called them weak, and so they didn't want to support them. They were anti-communist as well, so they had some common ground, and they were very popular with the army and also the middle classes. Okay, so when we talk about left and right, this is who we're talking about. But today we are purely going to be focusing on the left, and next week we are going to look at the right. So today we're just looking at the left. We're going to look at the communist threat to this new government. So who was the threat? It was the Spartacists, so something known as the Spartacist uprising. Okay, so this was a group of communists. It was a communist group led by two people, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, and this is them here. So that's Karl and that's Rosa. And Rosa supported the Russian Revolution. So if you remember, I said last week or the week, I think it was last week, Russia left the war quite early. It left in 1917 because they had a revolution, and Russia became the USSR and communist after that point. And a lot of people kind of looked over at this Russian Revolution and kind of wanted to be part of it, wanted that in their countries. But because Rosa had supported the Russian Revolution, she'd actually been quite violent and led a few protests during the First World War in Germany. She'd actually been put in prison during the First World War, and it was after she left, she kind of joined up with Karl, and they formed this communist group known as the Spartacists. Okay, so they were known as the Spartacists. So why did they decide to rebel? Well, they didn't trust the new SPD government, and they didn't think Ibert was capable of improving the lives of the working people. So they didn't think he would achieve what they wanted. So they wanted to get rid of him. Karl and Rosa wanted a big communist revolution, just like the Russians, and particularly because throughout December in 1917, that should say, not 18. There were regular clashes between the government and the revolutionaries, and they kind of joined up and thought, you know what, now is the time to strike, now is the time to go against this government and attempt to rule it, essentially, and bring about a revolution. So what did they do? Well, in January 1919, the Spartacists tried to stage a revolution. On the 5th of January, this is our key date, so 5th of January 1919, they captured the headquarters of the government's newspaper and telegraph bureau, but they didn't capture any other buildings. So they captured one big building and they decided to take over it, but that was it. And they expected that a lot of people, particularly working people, would join up and, you know, rise up with them and lead them to develop a full scale revolution, but that didn't happen. No one really supported them. They weren't prepared enough. You know, they'd only captured one building, and capturing one building is not enough. So by the 10th of January, so just 5 days later, the Free Corps had taken over the Spartacist headquarters, and they, by the 15th of January, had crushed the rebellion, and over 100 communists were killed, okay, which is a lot. Now, these Free Corps are ex-army. When the Treaty of Versailles came out and the army was limited to 100,000 men, the government obviously had to say to quite a lot in the army, you can no longer be part of the army, you're disbanded. And this group of people were known as Free Corps, and they actually supported the right. So they were right-wing in politics. So when we come to look at the right-wing threat next week, we may just come back and look at who these Free Corps were, okay? But this ex-army, the unit of ex-army, ex-soldiers, they were very much anti-communist, so they were happy to come and support the government and get rid of this communist threat. But because, you know, they didn't like communists and they kind of were a law unto their own, they did kill over 100 workers. And as a result, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were murdered. So it took the communist leaders away from them. So all the people who had supported the communists and looked up to their strong leaders, these leaders had been killed. So they've gone. And that kind of reduces the communist threat quite a lot, because if they've not got strong leaders leading them, then they're not going to really uprise against them anymore, if that makes sense. So Ibert had then successfully dealt with the threat, but it came at a high price, because he'd put a lot of his trust, he'd put the country's trust and, you know, country's welfare in the hands of these Free Corps, and these Free Corps who were ex-soldiers and also supporting the right wing of governments and politics. We don't know if they're going to be loyal or not, and next week we'll see that they're not particularly loyal. So he kind of put a gamble on. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't really ask the workers to help him because they would tend to support communists over him. So he didn't have a big enough army, didn't have a strong enough army. They were seen as quite a big threat, so he thought, I'll just go for the Free Corps. But obviously he didn't know if that was the best thing or not. And because the uprising was badly planned, they didn't get much support from the left wing. Rosa was captured, she was shot, she was dumped, her body was dumped in a canal in Berlin. And Karl Liebknecht was also murdered. But because of that, it just kind of made the Communist Party a lot weaker, the Spartacus Party a lot weaker, and therefore kind of left them. But it did mean that order was restored, and Eber had dealt with a threat. So his kind of first big challenge as the new leader of Germany, he'd dealt with quite successfully. He'd got rid of that threat quite quickly. So what I'd like you to do is, for today, have a go at answering these 4 questions using that. I've also put another link at the bottom, which is a sort of summary about the Spartacists. You might have actually watched it. If you remember, I put a few video links up before a few weeks ago for your tasks, pre-YouTube video lessons. So you might have already come across it, you might be familiar with some of this, which is brilliant if you are, but there's a clip at the bottom, so watch that as well, because that will help you with the Spartacists. And I'd like you to answer these 4 questions. So I want you to briefly explain why the Spartacists wanted to overthrow the Weimar Republic, explain how they tried to take over, explain what you think their strengths and weaknesses were in their takeover, and overall, how much of a threat do you think they pose? So you can maybe do that on a scale of 1 to 5, so 5 being a really big threat, 1 being not a very big threat. How much of a threat do you think they were to the government? So pause here and have a go at those questions. And then next week, we are going to have a look at the threat from the right. So we're going to have a look at more revolutionary threats to the government, more fighting, and we're going to meet someone called Wolfgang Kapp and how he led his Free Corps. That's right, the Free Corps who helped the government. He's now turning them against the government. And we're also going to have a look and be introduced to Adolf Hitler. So just to finish off today, can you have a go at answering these 5 questions without looking at your notes, without looking in your fact book? See if you can do them all by yourself. When, number 1, when Berlin was unsafe, where did the government move to? What is the German parliament called? So what's the what's their parliament called? Which communist group attempted to seize power in 1919? Who led the revolt? And which group did Eber use to help get rid of the revolt? Okay, so have a go at answering those questions and see how you do. These are results. Hopefully you all got 5 out of 5. Keep practicing these 5 questions. You'll notice that you've now got a little fact test. There's just 10 questions. They are from week 1 to week 4. I've not included next week's answers. So they're just week 1 to week 4. Have a go at it and see if how you do, how much you remember from the first lesson all the way through to today's lesson. And then next week we'll have a go at the last one. And if there are any problems, any issues, drop me an email, any questions. More than happy to answer them. All right, take care, Year 9. Bye bye.